this.
If you follow along.
They've got my name over here.
It is.
Yeah, it's just it doesn't usually sit in a committee meeting.
Okay. I'd like to call to order the City Council Finance Committee for the purposes of taking up the financing, that discussion that was at the last council meeting in terms of options for the additional $1.2 million loan connected to the Colonial Theater project. I'd like to have City Manager Myers address a memo that's in front of us to open the discussion, if you would, please.
Well, thank you, Councilor Littman. So as was charged to me at the September 11th meeting, when you've tabled the resolution regarding an additional $1.2 million in funding for the Colonial Theater project in order to identify how we would be looking to pay for that, I put together this two-page memo that I think it identifies a couple of strong positions that were core through the City Council, and that would be that we work within the city's tax cap and not present something that would exceed it, as this council has never exceeded the tax cap, or any council has never exceeded the tax cap in the 12 years it's been there. Second of all, we understand that would be loaning some money anyway, the $3 million originally, out of our undesignated fund balance. We wanted to make sure that we in no way impeded the city's cash flow ability at lower times of the year, and also that any repayment from additional funds, if it was coming out of the undesignated fund balance, should be repaid as rapidly as possible, as that being a priority to make sure that we're in good position, not only cash flow wise, but that we have the ability to be able to maneuver in an emergency type situation. Third, we talked about, the mayor spoke of 2 weeks ago, that the operational cost to operate the theater were going to be in the amount of $144,000 plus the cost of heating, cooling, electricity. So part of what I looked at is in how we structured this loan to Belknap EDC. Is there an opportunity to earn greater rate of return interest on those funds through the loan versus what we can earn on them sitting in our more conservative investments? And also, is there a way to address this without borrowing the money? In other words, kind of self-financing for a short period of time. And then beyond what we know is the cost of just the basic operations of the theater, we know still to be determined is how the theater will be run, who will be responsible for managing the theater in terms of booking acts and selling tickets and marketing. And again, we realize that our basic function is to operate the theater for community needs first, and we are not looking to be in the business of taking on risk in how the theater is managed for outside activities, so to speak. So with those four kind of core principles in place, I put together options that is exactly what they are. They're options. They're not necessarily all recommendations for you, but I wanted to identify possible sources to help facilitate the conversation tonight. So first off, we know the city was already going to contribute $3 million toward the project in the form of a loan, and we knew very comfortably that we could loan that money out of undesignated fund balance and still leave the city in a very strong position to handle its day-to-day needs. What I had asked our finance director, Donna Wooderman, to do is to identify if it was possible that that amount could be increased from the $3 million spoken of up to an amount of $3.6 million. So an additional $600,000 that the city, from funds on hand already, could be loaning toward the project and still allow us to handle all our activities very comfortably on a financial basis. And she looked at that, and we identified when our highs and the lows were during the course of the year in terms of when do we have more money sitting in the bank and when are we a little less flush, if you will. So no surprise, our two lowest times of the year are just before both property tax collection times, so approximately January 1 and July 1. And that's for the obvious reason of we're just in the midst of collecting property taxes at that point. But the other reason is at the end of the school year, and there tends to be a larger school payroll for retirements or people who may elect to take summer payments in certain lumps as opposed to spreading it out. And then in the December timeframe, before we collect the January 1 approximate due property taxes, we have our county tax payment due, which is in the area of $2.5 million. So that's a large check that gets written, if you will, to the county. Looking at that, we still feel very comfortable that we can cash flow $3.6 million out of our undesignated fund balance. Now, again, we carry a lot more money there in other reserve accounts, so there's funds there, but again, cash flowing, not a problem, and we know we could address that. On the other $600,000, we had looked at those dollars coming out of the current net balance in the downtown TIF account. And so the scenario I'm talking about first shows up on the third page of your document, and it's got a number 1 in black ink at the top of it. So this is the scenario that takes a look at a pro forma. If you looked almost all the way over to the last column, it says beginning balance $1,039,503. That's the balance sitting in the TIF account today. So this scenario shows removing $600,000 from that account on day 1 in cash, and that drops the balance down to $439,000. Now, the remainder of how it looks in the years for years 2, 3, and 4, working left to right, that would be the additional repayment from the TIF account back to the general fund of $150,000 a year for 4 years. That adds up to the other $600,000 we're speaking from. So $600,000 up front in cash, $600,000 paid in equal payments over 4 years. That would be one approach to the $1.2 million.
So we're talking general fund balance, not general fund budget.
Correct. So this would be repaying just back into the fund balance sitting there. The column listed annual revenue, right now we have $198,000 would be the projection. For next year we're projecting $198,000 in funds from the TIF account rolling in.
The appropriation for fiscal year 18 has already been taken into account in the $1,039,000, so that's why it's not listed there.
Great. And we took a very conservative 2% increase in the value of the downtown TIF district, so very conservative on this. We know we have the existing debt on the projects that were funded for the Riverwalk, the WOW Trail, the Main Street Bridge. That's under that bond payment column. So basically, we're saying that in the out years to use $150,000 in a repayment to the general fund, and you're using the bond payment on the existing debt and factoring in an amount just around $200,000 of coming in a new revenue. What does that do to the net balance over to the right? So you can see in 2018, after we make our full bond payment, we're expecting to have $330,000 left in the TIF account. Once we work through those 3 transactions I just outlined, in fiscal year 19, our balance would be $247,000. The same thing in fiscal year 20, 21, and then in 22, that's the end of the 4 payments of $150,000. And while the balance is at $38,000, we're still comfortably above it, and again, very conservative numbers. So that's one scenario of how to get the $1.2 million, basically in a little bit of extra funds being loaned from the fund balance and out of the TIF. If you turn to what's considered attachment number 2 on the back side of that page, that basically shows you the same scenario of the $600,000 coming out in a one-time payment, but instead it shows $100,000 a year being repaid to the fund balance from the downtown TIF as opposed to $150,000. So the only real difference is you can see it's a 6-year payback schedule at $100,000 a year. And you can see the net balance on the far column on the right goes to a low point of around $233,000. So just a little more conservative approach, but we're very comfortable with the first approach, saying that we know those funds are there, we know the baseline of value in the TIF district, and we feel that the first scenario works as well, even though it draws the net balance down a little bit lower. The third scenario, which is number 3 in big bold, basically says almost the same thing, but instead of using the cash right up front out of the TIF, it said, what happens if the city went out and borrowed the $1.2 million and the TIF paid it back? So the area to focus on there is really in kind of the middle columns under the actual costs. You can see after we would pay just a partial first year of interest of that $16,800, you could see that the interest for a full year is $31,000 the next year, and the principal repayments about $170,000. And if you go over two more columns to the right, you can see that it's on average about a $200,000 a year that the TIF would be paying to pay off a 7-year bond. And we did the 7 years because it tied with the ownership makeup with the credits and everything. So obviously, this is a scenario, but two things happen here. Number one, we now incur borrowing cost. We incur the interest expense because we're going out to a financial institution to borrow the $1.2 million as opposed to self-funding it. So we pick up the expense. The second component of it is if we were to loan the $4.2 million through a combination of TIF funds and fund balance funds, then we would be able to get all of the interest on that coming back to the city. And we're targeting that. It's a rate that's going to be pegged to the 10-year Treasury bond plus 0.25% in layman's terms. We think that rate's going to fall somewhere between 2.5% and 2.75% when we close on the Colonial Theater project in December. So at that rate, the $4.2 million will be generating us somewhere between $105,000 and $115,000 a year in interest. We would have no borrowing cost in the first two scenarios. If we went with scenario 3, we would be offsetting our interest on the $3 million by the cost to borrow the 1.2, if you will. So the net would not be anywhere near as strong. And again, as Mayor, I know, ran through a scenario 2 weeks ago that the rate of return that we're getting on these funds is far superior from what we've been getting through our normal investment products that we would go through with the city. The fourth scenario, just to put it out there, is we could fund the $1.2 million in a bond through the general fund. We would need to come up with the budget we're working on this year of about $17,000 to cover the half-year worth of interest, and then we would have to find a way to cover that $200,000 out of the general fund next year, and that doesn't come with a strong recommendation from me because I think trying to find a new $200,000 just to carry that additional debt service may squeeze out some other things, infrastructure, public safety, education, things that we want to do within our general fund budget anyway. So you certainly could look to do it on that route, but that would not be staff recommendation. So those are the four, and I kind of put them in a priority order. I think the first scenario works, and it makes the most sense.
Council Hamel?
Scott, on number 3, where we would borrow the money,
Yes.
is this 2016 bond cost, is that the one that we have out now?
Yes, so right now we pay $134,000 that we'll owe on that bond for the next fiscal year.
But the difference between this schedule and the other one is we'd made a partial interest payment, so that's why on the other schedules it's 108.
Well, if I'm looking at year 2,
Yep.
it says, so if we borrowed, it would be $202,006,
Yes,
and then the bond is $131 that we already have.
correct. So we would be
Okay,
paying
so the-
$330,000 for those two projects.
Okay, so okay,
And we have about $200,000 in new
going
income
in,
rolling in.
that's
so-
okay, because I was looking at the last column, and
Yeah. So it drops the balance by about $130,000, $140,000 a year, but you can see at that point, spread over the 7 years, you still run a low point of just over $200,000. So again,
it would actually cost more money not to borrow it. I mean,
To borrow.
to borrow
to
it,
borrow.
Yeah, absolutely.
than what we would be pulling out for those 4 years.
Correct, on both sides. Number one, we'd have the borrowing cost, and number two,
You have the interest coming
we'd be having the higher interest if it was all self-sourced, yes.
But at the same time, your TIF net balance is much higher under Plan 3, isn't it? It looks very strong.
It does. It
leaves
doesn't.
a lot of money
It doesn't
back.
drop as much. But if you do get down to year 7, you are at a $200,000 level, which I think is fairly comparable to scenario number 2 in year 6 is $234,000. So it's close, and it obviously does stay higher than scenario 1, where we do dip down to about $38,000.
Yeah, which is,
But again, I don't think these are revenues that we're projecting that aren't going to come true, because we know that this tax base is already in the downtown with the TIF. So it's built on by new value coming into it. I don't think we're in jeopardy of that number dropping significantly. Like, if motor vehicle registrations were to drop significantly like they did in 2009 and 2010, we would have to make adjustments within our budget for that. This is a base of value that started back in 2004, 2005, when we captured the baseline value of the district. And as new value gets added to it, that's a number that we anticipate to increase every year and not have an opportunity to really be in a decline.
It just, also, I think it's, if we could just look at, following the scenarios, there's a few pages of sort of some metrics I think they're important to consider in the context of everything. And the first one, which has page 74 on the bottom of it, is from our annual report, which shows our debt service as a percentage of our total expenditures. And you can see in 2016, we're at 7.5%, just, in perspective, given all that we've done. In 2009, we're at 8%. So, in terms of looking at it from like a 10-year horizon, kind of where we are in terms of all the things we've done in the city, I think it's important to have some perspective that we've kept borrowing costs as a percentage of our total budget as a fairly constant number. The second one is also from the annual report. That's
I updated that.
advertisement for you in terms of good job
I
that you do in
updated
putting
that
statistics.
based upon the information that I had,
Yep.
so that's close to what you should see in this
Okay. And-
fiscal, the year end, June 30th.
So we're limited to 3% of our annual expenditures in the operating budget as a debt cap, and right now, we're only using 28.8% of our debt capacity of our legal limit, and that calculation is, if you go to the very last page, is how it's arrived at. So, in terms of self-financing it, if we were to elect option one, we're not technically adding to any of these calculations, and we'll continue to see our percentage of debt service in the city budget continue to decline as a percentage, or at least stay within a relative range that we've seen over the last decade plus. My perspective on this just is there's no need in term, money's money no matter where it's coming from, and if we don't have to pay interest on it at commercial level, and we're actually benefiting by loaning it out, it seems to me to be where we'd want to go, which I think is sort of option one. But I'd like to hear what other councils have to say.
Scott, have we projected an increase in assessments over this period? I mean, 7 years is a long time, and we do anticipate growth, hopefully, downtown. Plus the fact, I don't know what the Genesis situation is, but they're putting millions of dollars into that building. That's going to be assessed higher, but are we not going to get a share of that?
They're not a property tax-paying entity on the two properties they have in the downtown TIF right now. We have had some discussions with them about maybe doing something in a payment of lieu of taxes. The other component that once they're in this new facility, their intention is to sell the two properties that are also in the TIF district, one on North Main Street and one on Church Street. And again, I can't control who an end user might be, but there's a likelihood they go back on the tax rolls. And if for some reason they weren't sold, but they weren't being used by Genesis, they would be taxed at that point if they stopped being used for the purpose they were intended for. So they couldn't just land bank them and leave them empty and avoid paying the taxes on them. So while this building, may not be paying taxes, there are two that are, I'd have to look at the assessment, but I think those two are comparable to the value of what this one was that would be offset by it. So I don't think there's a loss. Your first question is, are we not expecting to see more value in the downtown district? And absolutely, and we think the Colonial Theater will be a driving force for that. So in our adjustments, we've reflected a 2% growth in the value, which is a very conservative. I think the numbers work even if we were at a 0% growth to it. So again, I think we're comfortable on the numbers.
Sam?
Scott, I know the last page here about our capability of borrowing. But just want to hear from you as far as our capabilities, our borrowing power in the future, say within the next 3-4 years. What's your comment on that there? You know, to be able to go out and get bonds and things like that?
I still think we're a very solid entity. As Councilor Lippman pointed out, our percent of debt compared to what we could in the schools is also a very low number. Across all departments, even our water fund and our sewer fund collectively, very little debt in the city. And as you recall, the auditor coming in, we do have a fairly rapid pay-down schedule of that as well. And any of the debt issuances we've gone out to in my time here over the last 6 years, we have had at least 2, if not more, bids on them. And we've never had anybody come and say, we don't think your balance sheet looks right, we don't want to invest. I think that we had one situation where one of our local lenders, based on their own guidelines, had enough extended to the city from
Right.
their board of directors. They said, at this point, we've got enough loans with you, we need to, diversify our portfolio a little bit. But it was
By banking
by
regulation.
banking regulations, so it was nothing to do with our ability to repay.
Right.
It was for that reason only. But we have very good success, and ultimately, if we failed to attract attention from local banks, which again we've been very successful with, we can always go with the municipal bond bank.
Yep. So in the next few years, if we had to borrow, say, $4 million, there shouldn't be a problem on having the money to be able to repay that back
You're talking about for another purpose?
for another
It
purpose.
wouldn't be a problem for us acquiring it or paying it back. Obviously, if it was tied into the limits of the tax cap,
Yep.
we'd have to determine, how that fit into what was available for funds, and those decisions would be presented to the council, and they would be city council decisions.
Okay, thank you.
So if folks were comfortable with the option 1 approach, I think we could talk about at the full council meeting of recommending option 1, which would be to repay the $150,000 over a 4-year period back to the general fund balance, and there may have to be an amendment to the downtown TIF plan to include economic development opportunities as one of the included uses. But I'd suggest that we, remove the resolution from the table that was tabled last meeting, and then move in that direction if folks were comfortable with that.
Yep. You want to, as a motion to,
Sure.
as a committee? Okay.
If I could just jump in one thing.
Please.
So I think what Councilor Lippman was referring to is an email I received from Attorney Pat Wood today, Patrick Wood, who is chair of the Downtown TIF. And if it's okay, I think I'll summarize what he said. And I've tried to keep the Downtown TIF, knowing the timing of this was very short and there wasn't an opportunity to use them as the advisory board and the vetting board. I've tried to include them, and when we finalize these documents today, I sent a copy to all the members of the Downtown TIF as well, so at least they got it. Attorney Wood responded and basically brought up 3 points. One was, as the current plan is written, when the TIF district was adopted in the 04-05 timeframe, it spoke of, within the plan, which we needed to adopt for what we would target funds for, it identified transportation improvements, intersection improvements, streetscapes, walking past infrastructure, and it didn't specifically say the Colonial Theater, or it didn't say something maybe a little more general in nature like economic development opportunities. So he rightly pointed out, I haven't gone and pulled the document, but he did, and that's what a good chair of a committee did, and he pointed out it didn't say that, and I said, you're right on, and if you were to look to do this, we would need to go through the process of amending the TIF district plan to add something into it that says economic development opportunities or the Colonial Theater, something along those lines. And that's a process that's laid out in state law. Basically, you have a resolution that you refer to a public hearing to do an amendment to your TIF plan, which is our own internal city working document. It doesn't need state approval or anybody else's approval. It's a City of Laconia document, and I think it would be a prudent step along the way to amend that before, if it was your direction to to allocate, TIF funds for it, so that some kind of an economic development component was reflected in the plan. The second point he brought up was the ownership of the building going forward, and does it qualify if the city's not going to own it? I think it's very clear in the resolution that you read into the record at the last meeting 2 weeks ago that it indicates the city is buying the building at the end of the 7 years. So I don't have any concern about it not being a city-owned property, and therefore something that isn't appropriate for TIF funds. And then the third point, so the other key component of what was in the TIF plan was parking, infrastructure, but parking was a key one. The other thing that Attorney Wood brought up was, by going with this route, it kind of ties up the bulk of the funds for a few-year period, and there wouldn't necessarily be any funds remaining in a bucket of money, in a pot of money, to be used for any parking enhancements, improvements, repairs, what may be. And I agree with that yes, based on the scenarios we're talking about, again, very conservative with what we presented. If the value in the TIF district grew, there certainly could be more funds flowing into it, but I think, as you know me by now, and Donna as well, that we try to be very conservative with the estimates and not overextend ourselves. So those were 3 points of what he brought up. He indicated that obviously it's not a position of the downtown TIF because they're in between meetings and they're all just seeing this. He personally said he's very supportive of the Colonial and just wanted to share those. So I did give him a quick response that I agree we should amend the plan. I think we're okay on the public ownership, and he's correct that this would deplete for a short period of time the lion's share of the funds available to parking.
I think if you look at the long-term monies in the TIF beyond, in the first scenario, the balance of the TIF will be over $3 million in the future.
Exactly. So there's opportunity there, just for the short term, very short
Right.
term.
Even taking the money out.
Yes, exactly. Yep.
So, Councilor Hamilton, you want to?
Yeah, I'll make a motion that the Finance Committee approve the
Technically would be recommend.
recommend that number one be selected as the choice to be brought in front of the council, which is the $600,000 coming from fund balance and $600 coming from the TIF, and with the repayment of the schedule that's on, which is number one.
Include in that the economic development language that the entity.
Okay,
will
yep,
do.
and that we schedule probably a future public hearing or bring it to the council as far as amending the TIF documents to read that it also would include economic development.
Correct. So you're recommending that funding formula subject to the TIF plan being
Correct.
amended to reflect that?
Yep. And also probably, if we're going to look at the downtown, we should look at the other two also for that same reason.
Very good.
All right, Brenda, Councilor Bear, would you second
I'll
that?
second it.
All right, any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? It's unanimous. I don't think there's anything else to come before us. Thank you for so efficiently putting together this, both of you. I'm sorry?
Does anybody want to be heard back here?
I don't,
Does anybody want to be heard
does
back
anybody want to be heard back there on what we just took action on?
A little late.
Well, there's still, if you have comments that we could take to the full, since it's only a recommendation, if you have some comments. Sir, would you like to, can you come up to the microphone and identify yourself, please?
Drew Gillett, 84 Fenton, relatively new. I'm a little concerned that essentially you're putting all the TIF's money into one basket and not allowing very much TIF activity to occur for several years. I'd encourage you to consider option 2, which at least leaves some funds in there to take advantage of various opportunities that come along to be better invested. I'm encouraged by the city figuring out that it can take funds that it has and make its own interest on it to tune of better than the other folks, which is just wonderful. But there are opportunities for the city to invest in certain attributes of its buildings, which can pay much better rates of return than the 2 or 3% that you're getting on your TIF funds.
Do you
So-
have any specifics that you could put forward for us?
Absolutely. I had sent an email off to the city manager regarding one simple project, which is investing in solar panels for the roof of the parking garage. And that has a return on its investment in the 6 to 9% range, and can be improved from that with various other financing opportunities. So my suggestion is that instead of committing to $150,000 a year for 4 years, that you spread that out over the 6. I don't see the disadvantage of doing that anywhere, and that then allows the TIF funds to take and be spent on targets of opportunity that may come along that provide even better rates of return.
Thank you. Anybody else would like to add any comments? Hearing none, can we close the finance meeting and move to adjourn? Council Bear?
Yep.
Second by Council Hamel. Thank you. We're adjourned.